Hey there, history enthusiasts. Tonight we're stepping into the factories and coal mines of the Industrial Revolution and forget everything you've learned about this being humanity's great leap forward. We're not talking about inspiring stories of innovation and progress. We're talking about a world where 6-year-old children worked 16-hour shifts in textile mills, where factory workers breathed air so thick with metal dust their lungs turned black as coal, and where entire families lived, worked, and died without ever seeing sunlight. This is the brutal reality behind every history textbook's celebration of industrial progress. We're about to experience what it actually meant to be human fuel for the machine age. You'll witness children losing fingers to spinning looms, watch workers collapse from exhaustion only to be dragged back to their stations, and understand why many people preferred the poverty of rural life to the living hell of industrial prosperity. But that's just the beginning. Tonight we'll also journey through 4 other moments when human progress demanded unthinkable sacrifices, from plague-ravaged cities where medical advances killed more patients than they saved, to colonial expeditions where indigenous populations were systematically erased in the name of civilization, to scientific laboratories where researchers unknowingly poisoned themselves pursuing knowledge that would benefit future generations. So settle in, dim the lights, and prepare yourself for a journey into the shadow side of human advancement. Because after tonight, you'll realize that every labor protection law, every child safety regulation, every workplace right you take for granted was written in the blood and broken bones of people who paid the ultimate price for what we call progress. Welcome to the world where moving forward meant grinding people into dust, and somehow they survived long enough to build something better. Factory workers' daily nightmare. The factory bell cuts through the pre-dawn darkness of Manchester, jolting you from the few hours of fitful sleep you manage to steal in the overcrowded cellar you share with 2 other families. You have exactly 30 minutes to get dressed, gulp down whatever watery gruel passes for breakfast, and make the trek through streets that reek of coal smoke, human waste and industrial chemicals to reach the textile mill where you'll spend the next 14 hours of your life. You might think you understand hard work from modern experience. Long shifts, difficult bosses, demanding schedules. But Industrial Revolution factory work wasn't just hard labor. It was a systematic assault on human dignity and physical health that reduced men, women, and children to components in machines designed by people who never had to operate them. You're about to discover that the economic miracle that built the modern world was constructed on a foundation of human suffering so widespread and systematic that it redefined what it meant to be poor, to be expendable, and to be slowly killed by the very progress that promised salvation. Welcome to 1840s London, where the coal-darkened sky rains soot on overcrowded slums, where children work themselves to death before they reach adolescence, and where the life expectancy of a factory worker is shorter than that of a medieval peasant. This is where the modern world was born, in conditions that would break most people before they understood the magnitude of what they faced. The factory bell that wakes you every morning isn't just a time signal. It's the heartbeat of a new kind of society that measures human value and productivity per hour and treats workers as interchangeable parts in an industrial machine. Your workday begins at 5 a.m. and doesn't end until 7 p.m. 14 hours of standing, lifting, operating machinery, and breathing air so thick with cotton dust and coal smoke that your lungs will be permanently damaged within a few years of starting this job. The factory floor is a vision from a particularly creative hell. Massive steam-powered machines roar and clatter with enough noise to cause permanent hearing damage, while leather belts whip through the air with enough force to tear off limbs. The air is filled with particles of cotton wool and metal that create a constant haze through which gaslight struggles to penetrate. The temperature is kept deliberately high to prevent thread from breaking, creating a tropical climate that soaks workers in sweat while they operate machinery that can easily maim or kill. You work without breaks except for a 30-minute meal period at noon, during which you're expected to eat whatever food you've brought while standing at your machine ready to resume work the moment the bell rings. There are no sick days, no vacation time, and no compensation for injuries sustained on the job. If you're hurt badly enough that you can't work, you're simply replaced by one of the hundreds of desperate people waiting outside the factory gates every morning. The machinery you operate was designed for efficiency, not safety, Spinning frames, power looms, and carding engines have exposed gears, moving belts, and sharp metal parts that regularly catch clothing hair or body parts. Factory workers missing fingers, hands, or even entire arms are so common that they cease to attract notice. Children are particularly vulnerable to these machines because their small size allows them to crawl under and around equipment to clear jams and clean mechanisms while the machinery continues running. The noise level in the factory is so intense that workers develop a form of sign language to communicate over the roar of steam engines and mechanical looms. This industrial deafness isn't temporary. Prolonged exposure to machinery noise causes permanent hearing loss that leaves many factory workers partially deaf by the time they reach middle age. The constant vibration from steam-powered machinery also causes joint problems and nerve damage that physicians of the era don't understand and can't treat. Accidents are routine and often catastrophic. A moment's inattention while clearing a jam can result in a hand being crushed in metal gears. Loose clothing caught in moving belts can drag workers into machinery, causing injuries so severe that survival is unlikely. Steam explosions from poorly maintained boilers can kill dozens of workers at once, while fires spread rapidly through buildings filled with flammable materials and equipped with inadequate escape routes. The factory owners view these accidents as unfortunate but acceptable costs of doing business. No compensation is provided to injured workers or their families, and safety improvements are resisted because they might reduce productivity or cut into profits. The attitude toward worker safety is summed up in the common saying that it's cheaper to hire new workers than to make factories safer for existing ones. Industrial Revolution. London is a city where children begin working at ages that would shock modern observers, not because their families are particularly cruel, but because survival requires every family member to contribute whatever income they can generate. 6-year-old children work 12 to 14 hours a day in textile mills, their small fingers perfect for tying broken threads and cleaning lint from machinery that would be impossible for adults to reach. These child workers aren't attending school playing games or experiencing anything resembling childhood as we understand it. They wake before dawn work until after dark and fall asleep exhausted from labour that stunts their physical and mental development. Many never learn to read or write emerging from childhood as illiterate teenagers whose only skill is operating machinery under conditions that are slowly killing them. The work assigned to children is often more dangerous than adult labour because it requires them to crawl under and around moving machinery to clean, repair and maintain equipment while it continues operating. Children are expected to dart between moving parts their small size, making them ideal for accessing areas where larger workers would be immediately injured or killed. Factory supervisors prefer child workers for these tasks because their agility and fearlessness make them more productive than adults who understand the dangers involved. Physical punishment is routine for children who fail to meet productivity quotas or who make mistakes that slow production. Beatings with sticks, fines that reduce already minimal wages and public humiliation are standard disciplinary measures designed to maintain order and efficiency. Children who become sick or injured are often forced to continue working because their families can't afford the lost income, leading to permanent disabilities that affect them for the rest of their lives. The educational opportunities available to working children are virtually non-existent. Sunday schools provide basic literacy training for those few children whose families can spare them for a few hours each week. But most child workers receive no formal education whatsoever. This lack of education ensures that they remain trapped in factory work throughout their lives, unable to develop skills that might enable them to escape industrial labour. The psychological impact of childhood factory work is devastating and permanent. Children who spend their formative years in industrial environments develop chronic anxiety, depression, and behavioural problems that persist into adulthood. The constant stress of dangerous work, physical punishment, and family poverty creates trauma that affects their ability to form relationships, parent their own children, and function in normal social situations. Many children die before reaching adulthood, victims of industrial accidents, occupational diseases, or simple exhaustion from labour that exceeds human physical limits. Those who survive often bear permanent physical and psychological scars that mark them as products of an industrial system that valued productivity over human welfare. The reproductive health of female child workers is severely compromised by factory conditions leading to high rates of miscarriage, infant mortality, and birth defects in the next generation. Young women who spend their adolescence breathing industrial chemicals and working in extreme heat often experience fertility problems that affect their ability to have healthy children, perpetuating cycles of poverty and ill health across generations. Industrial Revolution. London's air is so polluted that breathing it is equivalent to smoking cigarettes continuously throughout the day. Coal smoke from thousands of factories and homes creates a permanent haze that blocks sunlight and deposits soot on everything exposed to the outside air. This pollution isn't just unpleasant, it's deadly, causing respiratory diseases that kill thousands of people every year while creating living conditions that would be considered uninhabitable by modern standards. The water supply in working-class neighbourhoods is contaminated with industrial waste human sewage and chemical runoff from factories that dump their byproducts directly into rivers and streams used for drinking water. Cholera, typhoid and dysentery spread rapidly through communities that have no access to clean water or adequate sanitation, creating epidemic conditions that kill entire families within days of the first symptoms appearing. The Thames River, once a source of fresh water and fish, has become an open sewer that carries industrial waste, human excrement and animal carcasses through the heart of London. The smell from the river during summer months is so intense that Parliament considers relocating because the stench makes government meetings impossible. Workers living near the Thames suffer from constant respiratory problems and gastrointestinal diseases caused by exposure to contaminated air and water. Industrial chemicals used in textile production, metalworking and other manufacturing processes are released directly into the environment without any consideration of their health effects. Lead, mercury, arsenic and other toxic substances accumulate in the air, water and soil, creating pollution levels that cause neurological damage, cancer and birth defects among workers and their families. The lack of environmental regulation means that factory owners can dispose of waste in whatever manner is cheapest and most convenient, regardless of the impact on surrounding communities. Toxic chemicals are dumped into streams buried in residential areas, or simply released into the air, creating health hazards that persist for decades after the original pollution occurred. Indoor air quality in factories is even worse than outdoor pollution, as workers breathe air filled with particles from whatever materials they're processing. Cotton workers develop mill fever from inhaling cotton dust, while metal workers suffer from lung diseases caused by breathing metal particles and chemical fumes. These occupational health problems are considered normal consequences of industrial work, rather than preventable hazards that could be reduced through improved ventilation and safety measures. The medical understanding of pollution-related diseases is primitive, with physicians unable to connect environmental conditions to the health problems they observe in industrial workers. Respiratory diseases, skin conditions, and neurological problems are attributed to moral failings, poor character, or divine punishment, rather than to the toxic conditions in which people are forced to live and work. Treatment for pollution-related illnesses is largely ineffective because doctors don't understand their causes and have no way to remove patients from the contaminated environments that created their health problems. Workers suffering from industrial diseases are often advised to work harder, eat less, or pray more fervently, treatments that do nothing to address the environmental causes of their conditions. The working-class housing that surrounds London's industrial districts represents some of the worst living conditions in human history, with entire families crowded into cellars and single rooms that lack adequate ventilation, sanitation, or protection from the elements. These slums are designed to extract maximum rent from minimum space, creating population densities that make epidemic disease inevitable, while ensuring that residents have no escape from the industrial pollution that surrounds them. A typical working-class family of 6 or 8 people might share a single basement room that measures perhaps 10 feet by 12 feet, with no windows, no running water, and no toilet facilities. They sleep on straw mattresses placed directly on dirt floors that flood whenever it rains, creating conditions that breed disease while destroying what little clothing and furniture families manage to acquire. Multiple families often share these basement accommodations with 20 or 30 people living in spaces designed for perhaps half that number. Privacy is non-existent, sanitation is impossible, and personal hygiene becomes a luxury that few can afford. The smell from so many people living in such close quarters, combined with the stench from primitive toilet facilities and industrial pollution, creates an atmosphere that would be unbearable to anyone not forced to endure it for survival. Rent for these accommodations consumes such a large portion of working-class incomes that families have little money left for food, clothing, or medical care. Landlords know that desperate workers will accept any living conditions rather than face homelessness, enabling them to charge high rents for accommodations that would be considered uninhabitable under normal circumstances. The lack of adequate toilet facilities means that human waste accumulates in courtyards, streets, and any available open space, creating health hazards that affect entire neighborhoods. Shared privies serving dozens of families become breeding grounds for disease, while the absence of waste removal services means that neighborhoods become increasingly contaminated over time. Water for drinking, cooking, and washing must be carried from public pumps that may be contaminated with sewage and industrial waste. Families often have to walk considerable distances to reach these water sources, and the water they obtain is frequently unsafe to drink without boiling, a luxury that requires fuel most families can't afford. Cooking facilities consist of small fireplaces that provide inadequate heat for preparing meals, while filling rooms with smoke that exacerbates respiratory problems. Families subsist on bread, thin gruel, and whatever scraps they can afford, creating nutritional deficiencies that weaken their ability to resist disease and perform physical labor. The absence of adequate lighting means that working families spend their evenings in darkness, unable to read, mend clothing, or engage in activities that might improve their circumstances. Candles and oil for lamps are expenses that few families can afford, leaving them dependent on whatever daylight penetrates their overcrowded living spaces. Factory accidents occur with such regularity that they cease to be news unless they're particularly spectacular or involve large numbers of casualties. Workers lose fingers to machinery, suffer burns from steam pipes, and are crushed by equipment that lacks basic safety features. These injuries often result in permanent disability that leaves workers unable to support their families while receiving no compensation from employers who view accidents as inevitable costs of production. The most common accidents involve clothing or hair becoming caught in moving machinery, dragging workers into gears, belts, or other mechanisms that can cause severe injury or death. Women and children are particularly vulnerable to these accidents because their long hair and loose clothing are more likely to become entangled in equipment that lacks protective guards or safety devices. Steam explosions from poorly maintained boilers represent one of the most feared industrial hazards, capable of killing dozens of workers instantly while destroying entire sections of factories. These explosions occur without warning when pressure builds up in boilers that lack adequate safety valves or are operated by workers who don't understand the dangers of steam under pressure. Fire spreads rapidly through factories filled with flammable materials and equipped with inadequate escape routes. Workers on upper floors often find themselves trapped when fires block stairways, leading to deaths from smoke inhalation or desperate jumps from windows. Factory owners resist installing fire escapes or sprinkler systems because they view safety measures as unnecessary expenses that reduce profitability. Chemical burns from industrial acids, alkalis, and other substances used in manufacturing processes cause injuries that heal slowly and often leave permanent scars or disabilities. Workers handling these chemicals receive no protective equipment and little training about their dangers, leading to accidents that could be easily prevented with basic safety measures. Repetitive motion injuries affect workers who perform the same movements thousands of times each day, causing joint damage, nerve problems, and chronic pain that interferes with their ability to work. These conditions are not recognized as legitimate medical problems, but are attributed to worker laziness or moral weakness by employers who refuse to modify working conditions that cause preventable injuries. Eye injuries from flying metal particles, chemical splashes, and inadequate lighting create vision problems that make workers more vulnerable to other accidents while reducing their ability to perform skilled labor. Many factory workers develop partial blindness that limits their employment options and condemns them to the lowest paying and most dangerous jobs. The cumulative effect of workplace hazards means that factory workers age prematurely and die younger than people in other occupations. The combination of toxic air, dangerous machinery, and physically demanding labor creates health problems that affect every aspect of workers' lives, while reducing their life expectancy to levels that would be considered catastrophic in modern societies. Workers who become too injured or sick to continue factory labour often face destitution, because no social safety net exists to support disabled workers or their families. Workhouses provide minimal assistance under conditions designed to be so unpleasant that only the most desperate seek help, while charity organisations can assist only a small fraction of those in need. The economic pressures of industrial revolution capitalism create a labour market where workers are treated as disposable commodities rather than human beings with rights and dignity. Factory owners can easily replace injured or rebellious workers with new recruits from the vast pool of unemployed people desperate for any source of income, eliminating incentives to improve working conditions or worker treatment. Wages are kept at subsistence levels that allow workers to survive, but never to accumulate enough money to escape factory labour or improve their circumstances. This economic trap ensures a steady supply of workers willing to accept dangerous conditions while preventing the development of a middle class that might demand better treatment. The competition between workers for available jobs drives wages down and prevents collective action that might improve working conditions. Workers who attempt to organise for better treatment can be easily fired and replaced by others willing to accept whatever conditions employers choose to impose. The legal system provides no protection for workers who are injured on the job, cheated of wages, or subjected to unsafe working conditions. Courts generally side with employers in disputes with workers viewing labour relations as private contracts where government intervention is inappropriate. The absence of workers' compensation, health insurance, or retirement benefits means that factory workers face financial catastrophe whenever they become unable to work due to injury, illness, or old age. This insecurity affects every aspect of workers' lives, creating constant anxiety about the future, while preventing long-term planning or investment in education and skills development. Women factory workers face additional challenges, including sexual harassment, lower wages than men for similar work, and the double burden of factory labour combined with domestic responsibilities. Pregnant women continue working until they give birth, often returning to factory work within days of delivery because they cannot afford to lose wages. The social isolation of factory workers prevents the development of community organisations and mutual support networks that might improve their circumstances. Long working hours, exhaustion, and poverty leave little time or energy for social activities that might build solidarity among workers facing similar challenges. Child labour ensures that the next generation of workers will be as trapped in factory labour as their parents, perpetuating cycles of poverty and exploitation across generations. Children who begin working in factories at young ages never develop the education or skills that might enable them to escape industrial labour, ensuring a steady supply of workers willing to accept substandard conditions. The gradual organisation of workers into unions during the mid-19th century represented the beginning of improvements in factory conditions. But these changes came slowly and faced fierce resistance from employers who viewed worker organisation as a threat to their authority and profits. Early labour organisers faced imprisonment, blacklisting, and violence from both employers and government authorities. The development of factory legislation regulating working hours, child labour, and safety conditions emerged only after decades of worker activism and public pressure from social reformers who documented the horrible conditions in industrial workplaces. These reforms were bitterly opposed by factory owners who argued that regulation would destroy British competitiveness and economic prosperity. The improvements in factory conditions that occurred during the later 19th century came at enormous human cost as generations of workers suffered and died under conditions that were eventually recognised as unacceptable. The legacy of these early industrial workers includes not just the economic prosperity they created, but also the labour rights and safety regulations that protect modern workers. The transition from agricultural to industrial society created dislocations and hardships that affected entire populations, destroying traditional ways of life while creating new forms of poverty and social problems. The benefits of industrialization were eventually distributed more broadly, but the initial costs were borne almost entirely by working-class families who had little choice but to accept whatever conditions the new economy imposed. The Industrial Revolution demonstrates both humanity's remarkable capacity for adaptation and the dangers of economic systems that prioritize productivity and profit over human welfare. The technologies and organizational methods developed during this period created unprecedented prosperity. but they also revealed how easily human dignity can be sacrificed in pursuit of economic growth. Understanding the conditions faced by Industrial Revolution workers helps us appreciate the labour rights safety regulations and social programs that protect modern workers, while reminding us that these protections were achieved through decades of struggle by people who faced conditions that would be considered intolerable today. The factory workers of Industrial Revolution London created the foundation for modern prosperity through their labour suffering and eventual organisation into movements that demanded better treatment. Their legacy includes not just the economic progress they enabled, but also the recognition that human welfare must be protected even during periods of rapid economic change. Standing today in the preserved ruins of Industrial Revolution factories, visitors can sense both the energy and innovation that transformed human society and the human cost of progress that came without adequate concern for worker welfare. These sites remind us that technological advancement without corresponding social progress can create conditions that diminish rather than enhance human dignity. The smokestack and the factory floor represent both human achievement and human exploitation symbols of our capacity to reshape the world through technology, while often failing to protect those whose labour makes such transformations possible. The lesson of Industrial Revolution. London is that progress without compassion creates prosperity, for some, at the cost of enormous suffering for others, and that true advancement requires both technological innovation and social justice. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein inspiration. The summer of 1816 would later be called the Year Without a Summer, as volcanic ash from Mount Tambora's eruption blocked sunlight across Europe, creating an atmosphere of perpetual gloom that seemed to match the dark preoccupations of a remarkable group of writers gathered at Villa Diodati on the shores of Lake Geneva. Here, in this atmosphere of unnatural darkness and intellectual electricity, 18-year-old Mary Godwin, not yet, Mary Shelley would conceive one of literature's most enduring and prophetic works. But Frankenstein wasn't born from pure imagination. It emerged from a unique convergence of scientific revolution, personal trauma, and cultural anxiety that made Mary Shelley's villa the perfect laboratory for creating a story that would define our modern fears about technology's power to reshape human nature. The novel that emerged from that strange summer would prove remarkably prescient, anticipating anxieties about genetic engineering, artificial intelligence, and scientific responsibility that remain relevant 2 centuries later. You might think you know the Frankenstein story from movie adaptations and popular culture, but Mary Shelley's original novel was far more sophisticated and disturbing than the simplified versions that followed. Her creature wasn't a mindless monster, but an articulate being capable of eloquent speech and complex emotions, making his abandonment by his creator all the more tragic and his revenge all the more justified. Welcome to the Villa Diodati in the summer of 1816, where a teenage girl's nightmare became a prophetic vision of science without moral limits, and where the foundations of science fiction were laid by minds grappling with questions about creation, responsibility, and what it means to be human in an age of unprecedented technological power. The Villa Diodati, in the summer of 1816, hosted one of the most remarkable intellectual gatherings in literary history, bringing together minds that would shape European culture for generations. Lord Byron, already famous for his scandalous poetry and romantic adventures, had rented the villa as a retreat from the social pressures and financial difficulties that plagued him in England. His presence attracted a circle of writers and intellectuals drawn by his reputation and the stimulating conversation that surrounded him. Percy Bysshe Shelley, the radical poet and political philosopher, arrived with his companion Mary Godwin, daughter of the feminist writer Mary Wollstonecraft, and the political philosopher William Godwin. Their relationship was itself scandalous, as Percy was still married to another woman when he began his affair with Mary. The couple's unconventional arrangement reflected the radical political and social ideas that characterized their circle. John Polidori Byron's personal physician and aspiring writer completed the core group that would spend the summer exploring questions about science, philosophy, and human nature that were reshaping European intellectual life. Polidori's medical training provided scientific knowledge that informed the group's discussions about the boundaries between life and death that were being challenged by new discoveries in anatomy and chemistry. The villa itself provided an ideal setting for intellectual experimentation, with its large rooms, extensive library, and spectacular views of Lake Geneva and the Alps. The building's isolation from conventional society allowed the group to explore controversial ideas and unconventional relationships without the social constraints that would have limited their freedom in London or other major cities. The summer's unusual weather caused by volcanic ash from Mount Tambora's eruption in distant Indonesia created an atmosphere of perpetual gloom that seemed to encourage dark thoughts and supernatural speculation. Constant rain and unseasonably cold temperatures kept the group indoors, forcing them to entertain themselves through conversation reading and storytelling that took increasingly gothic and philosophical directions. The intellectual atmosphere at Villa Diodati was charged with discussions about the latest scientific discoveries and their implications for understanding human nature and the universe. The group read widely in contemporary science philosophy and literature, engaging with ideas that challenged traditional religious and philosophical certainties about creation, consciousness, and moral responsibility. Byron's charismatic personality dominated many conversations, but he also encouraged others to develop their own ideas and creative projects. His combination of literary genius, social rebellion, and philosophical sophistication created an environment where unconventional thinking was not just tolerated, but celebrated as essential for artistic and intellectual progress. The scientific revolution of the late 18th and early 19th centuries provided the intellectual foundation for the philosophical and literary experiments that would emerge from Villa Diodati. Recent discoveries in chemistry, anatomy, and natural philosophy had begun to reveal the mechanical processes underlying life itself, suggesting that the boundary between living and non-living matter might not be as absolute as previously believed. Luigi Galvani's experiments with electrical stimulation of dead tissue had demonstrated that electricity could cause muscle contractions in corpses, leading to speculation that electrical force might be the secret of life itself. These galvanic experiments suggested that death might not be irreversible, and that the proper application of electrical energy might restore life to dead organisms. Giovanni Aldini's public demonstrations of electrical reanimation, including his famous experiment of applying electrical current to the corpse of an executed criminal, had both fascinated and horrified European audiences. Aldini's work suggested that the boundary between life and death was more permeable than traditional religious and philosophical teachings indicated. The discovery of oxygen and other gases had revealed that respiration was a chemical process rather than a mystical function, further mechanizing understanding of life processes. Antoine Lavoisier's work on combustion and respiration suggested that living beings were sophisticated chemical machines rather than vessels for immaterial souls. Advances in anatomy, particularly the detailed dissections and anatomical drawings that were becoming available to educated readers, provided unprecedented insight into the physical structures that supported life. These anatomical revelations made it possible to imagine that life might be reconstructed if the proper physical and chemical conditions could be assembled. The development of chemistry as a rigorous science had begun to reveal the fundamental processes that governed both living and non-living matter, suggesting that the same natural laws operated throughout the universe. This mechanistic worldview implied that life itself might eventually be understood and controlled through scientific knowledge and technological manipulation. Erasmus Darwin's speculative writings about evolution and the transformation of species provided a framework for thinking about the malleability of life forms and the possibility that new kinds of beings might be created through scientific intervention. His ideas about the gradual development of complex organisms from simple forms suggested that creation was an ongoing process rather than a completed divine act. The philosophical implications of these scientific discoveries were profound and disturbing, challenging fundamental assumptions about human nature, divine authority, and moral responsibility that had guided European civilization for centuries. The group at Villa Diodati grappled with questions about whether scientific knowledge should be pursued regardless of its moral implications, and whether human beings had the right to assume godlike powers over life and death. Mary Shelley's personal experiences with death and loss provided the emotional foundation for her exploration of themes related to creation, abandonment, and responsibility that would become central to Frankenstein. Her mother, Mary Wollstonecraft, had died shortly after giving birth to Mary, leaving her daughter to grow up with a profound sense of loss and questions about maternal abandonment that would influence her understanding of creator-creature relationships. Mary's relationship with Percy Shelley was marked by tragedy and loss that deepened her understanding of mortality and the fragility of human connections. The couple had lost their first child in infancy, an experience that brought Mary face to face with the arbitrariness of death and the powerlessness of human love to protect against ultimate loss. The social ostracism that Mary and Percy faced because of their unconventional relationship provided insight into how society treats those who violate accepted norms and expectations. Their experience of being rejected by respectable society helped Mary understand the isolation and resentment that her creature would feel when rejected by his creator and by human society generally. Mary's education, guided by her father William Godwin's progressive ideas about child-rearing and intellectual development, had exposed her to radical political and philosophical ideas that challenged conventional thinking about authority, responsibility, and social justice. This intellectual background prepared her to explore complex moral questions about scientific responsibility and social obligation. The feminist ideas that Mary had inherited from her mother's writings provided a framework for understanding the dynamics of power, abandonment, and responsibility that would become central to the Frankenstein story. Mary Wollstonecraft's analysis of how society fails to protect vulnerable individuals informed Mary's portrayal of the creature's abandonment and victimization. Percy Shelley's radical political philosophy, particularly his atheism and his critique of traditional authority structures, influenced Mary's willingness to imagine a world where human beings might assume godlike powers, while failing to accept the responsibilities that such power entailed. Percy's political writings about justice and responsibility provided intellectual tools for analyzing the moral dimensions of scientific discovery. The Romantic movement's emphasis on emotion, individual experience, and the sublime aspects of nature provided aesthetic and philosophical frameworks for exploring the psychological dimensions of creation and abandonment. Romantic literature's focus on intense emotional states and psychological extremes helped Mary develop her portrayal of both Victor Frankenstein's obsession and the creature's emotional development. The Gothic literary tradition, with its emphasis on horror, the supernatural, and the consequences of transgressing natural boundaries, provided narrative techniques and thematic frameworks that Mary could adapt for exploring the implications of scientific advancement. Gothic fiction's focus on guilt punishment and the return of repressed elements offered models for structuring her story about scientific hubris and its consequences. The famous ghost story contest that Byron proposed on June 16, 1816, provided the immediate catalyst for Mary's creation of Frankenstein, but the intellectual and emotional foundations for the story had been developing throughout her life and were crystallized by the unique atmosphere of Villa Diodati. Byron's challenge to the assembled company to write ghost stories reflected the group's fascination with supernatural themes and their desire to explore the boundaries between rational explanation and mysterious phenomena. The contest was both entertainment and intellectual exercise, encouraging participants to engage with questions about fear, mortality, and the unknown that was central to contemporary cultural anxieties. Mary initially struggled to develop a story idea that would meet her own standards and satisfy the sophisticated literary tastes of her companions. Unlike the others who quickly produced short pieces, Mary sought to create something more substantial and philosophically significant that would justify her participation in such distinguished literary company. The breakthrough came when Mary experienced a waking dream or vision that provided the central image for her story. A scientist kneeling beside a creature he had assembled from dead body parts, watching in horror as his creation showed signs of life. This image captured both the scientific possibilities that contemporary discoveries suggested and the moral horror of creation without responsibility. The development of this initial vision into a complete novel required Mary to work through complex questions about scientific ethics, social responsibility, and the nature of humanity that reflected both her personal experiences and the intellectual climate of her time. The story became a vehicle for exploring fundamental questions about creation, abandonment, and revenge that resonated with contemporary anxieties about scientific and social change. Mary's decision to frame the story as a series of nested narratives told by different characters allowed her to explore multiple perspectives on the central moral questions while creating a complex literary structure that matched the sophistication of the philosophical issues she was addressing. The narrative technique reinforced the story's themes about the difficulty of understanding truth and the consequences of limited perspective. The novel's scientific elements reflected Mary's careful research into contemporary scientific theories and discoveries, demonstrating her commitment to creating a story that would be both literally sophisticated and scientifically plausible, according to the knowledge available in her time. Her scientific research included reading works by Humphrey Davy Erasmus Darwin and other leading natural philosophers. The psychological realism with which Mary portrayed both Victor Frankenstein and his creature reflected her understanding of human nature and her ability to imagine the emotional consequences of unprecedented situations. Her portrayal of the creature's intellectual and emotional development was particularly innovative, presenting him as a complex being capable of both eloquence and violence. Victor Frankenstein's character embodies contemporary anxieties about scientific ambition and the dangers of pursuing knowledge without considering its moral implications. His obsession with creating life reflects the period's fascination with scientific discovery while warning about the consequences of scientific hubris and social irresponsibility. Frankenstein's educational background and scientific training reflect the actual educational opportunities and scientific knowledge available to educated young men in the early 19th century. Mary's portrayal of his scientific studies was informed by her research into contemporary university curricula and scientific practices, giving the character realistic intellectual foundations for his extraordinary achievements. The secrecy with which Frankenstein pursues his research reflects both the controversial nature of his experiments and the individualistic approach to scientific discovery that characterized much research during this period. His isolation from colleagues and mentors eliminates the social constraints and peer review that might have prevented his ethical failures. Frankenstein's horror at his creature's appearance and his immediate abandonment of his creation reflect deep-seated anxieties about physical deformity and social acceptance that were particularly intense in a society that valued conventional beauty and social conformity. His reaction demonstrates how prejudice and fear can override moral responsibility and rational judgment. The progressive deterioration of Frankenstein's health and mental state as he pursues his research illustrates the personal costs of scientific obsession and the dangers of sacrificing human relationships and social connections for abstract intellectual achievement. His decline serves as a warning about the need for balance between intellectual pursuits and social responsibilities. Frankenstein's refusal to take responsibility for his creature's actions or to provide guidance and companionship for his creation reflects broader questions about parental and social responsibility that were particularly relevant in a period of rapid social change. His abandonment of the creature parallels contemporary concerns about social dislocation and the breakdown of traditional support systems. The creature's character represents Mary Shelley's most innovative and psychologically sophisticated creation, presenting a being who is simultaneously innocent and dangerous, articulate and primitive, sympathetic and terrifying. Unlike the mindless monster of popular adaptations, Shelley's creature possesses remarkable intelligence and emotional depth, making his abandonment and subsequent violence all the more tragic and morally complex. The creature's physical appearance, never fully described in the novel, represents contemporary anxieties about deformity, difference, and social acceptance. His gigantic stature and assembled features make him immediately recognizable as artificial, ensuring that he can never blend into human society, despite his emotional and intellectual capabilities. This physical otherness becomes a permanent barrier to social acceptance that shapes every aspect of his existence. The creature's rapid intellectual development through reading and observation demonstrates both his inherent capacity for learning and the importance of education in forming moral character. His literary education, acquired through discovering Paradise Lost Plutarch's Lives and Goethe's Sorrows of young Werther, provides him with frameworks for understanding his situation while also creating unrealistic expectations about human society and relationships. The creature's eloquence and philosophical sophistication contrast sharply with his physical appearance, creating cognitive dissonance that makes him even more unsettling to both other characters and readers. His ability to analyze his situation and articulate his grievances demonstrates that his violence stems not from mindless aggression, but from rational anger at his treatment by his creator and society. The creature's isolation from human society represents an extreme form of social alienation that was particularly relevant to the Romantic period's concerns about individualism, community, and belonging. His complete exclusion from human relationships makes him a perfect figure for exploring questions about the social foundations of morality and the consequences of absolute rejection. The creature's gradual turn toward violence represents a commentary on how society creates the very monsters it fears through prejudice, abandonment, and refusal to accept responsibility for vulnerable individuals. His murders are not random acts of violence, but carefully targeted revenge against his creator's loved ones, demonstrating both his intelligence and his understanding of how to inflict maximum psychological damage. The creature's demand that Frankenstein create a companion for him raises profound questions about rights, responsibilities, and the ethics of creation that anticipate contemporary debates about reproductive technology, genetic engineering, and artificial intelligence. His argument that he deserves companionship because he exists reflects natural law theories about fundamental rights while challenging conventional notions about who qualifies for moral consideration. The creature's final fate, disappearing into the Arctic wilderness after Frankenstein's death, leaves his story unresolved while suggesting that the consequences of irresponsible creation cannot be easily contained or corrected. His survival beyond his creator's death implies that the problems created by scientific hubris may persist long after the original scientists are gone. The novel's exploration of scientific responsibility reflects contemporary debates about the proper limits of human knowledge and the moral obligations of researchers who make discoveries with potentially dangerous applications. Mary Shelley anticipated modern concerns about scientific ethics by over a century, raising questions that remain relevant in our age of genetic engineering, artificial intelligence, and biotechnology. The theme of creation without responsibility runs throughout the novel, connecting Victor Frankenstein's abandonment of his creature to broader questions about parental, social, and scientific obligations. The story suggests that the act of creation, whether biological or artificial, creates permanent responsibilities that cannot be avoided or transferred to others. The novel's treatment of natural versus artificial creation reflects contemporary anxieties about science's increasing ability to manipulate and control natural processes. Frankenstein's artificial creation of life represents a violation of natural order that brings consequences extending far beyond his original intentions, suggesting that some forms of knowledge may be too dangerous to pursue. The relationship between creator and creature mirrors contemporary concerns about parent-child relationships, particularly regarding abandonment, neglect, and the failure to provide proper guidance and support. The creature's resentment toward his creator reflects broader social concerns about the responsibilities of those who bring new beings into existence. The novel's scientific elements, while speculative for Mary Shelley's time, have proven remarkably prescient in anticipating developments in genetics, biotechnology, and artificial intelligence that raise similar ethical questions about creation, responsibility, and the limits of scientific ambition. Frankenstein has become a touchstone for debates about scientific ethics, precisely because it identified fundamental moral issues that transcend specific technologies. The story's emphasis on the unintended consequences of scientific discovery reflects understanding that technological advancement often creates problems that its creators never anticipated. Victor Frankenstein's inability to control or guide his creation once it comes to life illustrates how scientific innovations can develop beyond their creator's intentions or control. The novel's reception and influence demonstrate how a work of fiction can shape scientific and cultural debates for generations, providing metaphors and frameworks for understanding new technologies and their implications. Frankenstein has become shorthand for concerns about scientific hubris and uncontrolled technological development, influencing how societies approach everything from genetic engineering to artificial intelligence. Mary Shelley's achievement in Frankenstein was to create a story that functioned simultaneously as Gothic horror philosophical exploration and prophetic warning about the future of science and technology. Her novel established science fiction as a literary genre, capable of serious philosophical and social analysis, while entertaining readers with compelling narrative and psychological complexity. The continuing relevance of Frankenstein reflects the ongoing tension between scientific possibility and ethical responsibility that characterizes modern technological society. Each new scientific advance raises fresh versions of the questions that Mary Shelley identified in 1816. How far should human beings go in attempting to control natural processes? What responsibilities do creators bear for their creations? How can society ensure that scientific advancement serves human welfare rather than creating new forms of suffering? The novel's influence on subsequent science fiction established a tradition of using speculative technology to explore fundamental questions about human nature, social responsibility, and the unintended consequences of progress. Writers from H.G. Wells to contemporary authors of genetic engineering fiction have followed Mary Shelley's example in using scientific speculation to examine moral and social issues. The transformation of Frankenstein's creature from Mary Shelley's articulate, sympathetic being into the mindless monster of popular culture reflects broader patterns in how society processes anxieties about technology and change. The simplification of complex moral questions into simple narratives of good versus evil often obscures the nuanced ethical issues that make these stories relevant to contemporary debates. Modern adaptations and reinterpretations of Frankenstein continue to find new ways to apply Mary Shelley's insights to contemporary scientific and technological developments. Films, novels, and other works that draw on Frankenstein themes demonstrate the story's continued relevance for understanding the relationship between scientific capability and moral responsibility. The biographical elements that influenced Mary Shelley's creation of Frankenstein, her experiences with loss, abandonment, and social ostracism, gave the novel emotional authenticity that transcends its speculative scientific elements. Her personal understanding of rejection and alienation enabled her to create a creature whose suffering feels genuinely tragic despite his artificial origins. The collaborative intellectual environment at Villa Diodati demonstrates how creative breakthroughs often emerge from the intersection of multiple perspectives and areas of expertise. The combination of literary, scientific, and philosophical knowledge that characterized the group's discussions provided the intellectual resources necessary for Mary Shelley's innovative synthesis of Gothic fiction and scientific speculation. The summer of 1816's unique atmospheric conditions created by volcanic ash that blocked sunlight across Europe provided both practical constraints that kept the group indoors and symbolic associations with darkness and unnatural phenomena that influenced the Gothic atmosphere of the stories they created. The year without a summer became a perfect metaphor for the unnatural scientific manipulations that would characterize Mary Shelley's novel. The enduring power of Frankenstein lies in its recognition that scientific and technological capabilities advance faster than human wisdom about how to use them responsibly. Mary Shelley's insight that knowledge without ethical reflection leads to disaster has proven prophetic across 2 centuries of scientific development, from the Industrial Revolution through nuclear weapons to genetic engineering and artificial intelligence. Standing today at Villa Diodati, visitors can sense both the intellectual excitement and the moral urgency that shaped one of literature's most influential works. The beautiful setting that inspired Mary Shelley's dark vision reminds us that the greatest creative achievements often emerge from the tension between opposing forces. In this case, between the promise of scientific progress and the recognition of its potential dangers. Mary Shelley's achievement was to create a story that captured both the exhilaration and the terror of living in an age when human knowledge was advancing faster than human wisdom. Her teenage nightmare became a permanent part of our cultural consciousness, providing a framework for understanding the moral challenges that accompany scientific and technological power. In creating Frankenstein, Mary Shelley gave us not just a compelling story, but a way of thinking about responsibility, creation, and the unintended consequences of human ambition that remains as relevant today as it was in the summer of 1816. Chinese Forbidden City life. Behind the vermilion walls and golden roofs of Beijing's Forbidden City lived a world so elaborately ritualized that every gesture, every word, every moment of daily existence was governed by protocols that transformed human beings into living components of an imperial machine designed to demonstrate the emperor's cosmic authority. For nearly 5 centuries, thousands of people spent their entire lives within these walls, their identities subsumed into ceremonial roles that defined every breath and movement according to ancient traditions that brooked no deviation. You might imagine that life in the world's most magnificent palace would be luxurious and privileged, filled with beauty, comfort, and unlimited access to the finest things in life. But the Forbidden City was more prison than paradise for most of its inhabitants. A place where personal desires, individual thoughts, and basic human freedoms were sacrificed to maintain a social order so rigid that it made medieval European court life seem relaxed by comparison. To live within the Forbidden City meant accepting that your life belonged not to yourself, but to an emperor you might never see serving a cosmic order that placed ritual perfection above human happiness and collective ceremony above individual dignity. The magnificent architecture and priceless artworks that surrounded daily life were constant reminders that beauty and power came at the cost of human autonomy and personal freedom. Welcome to a world where the ultimate luxury was the privilege of serving absolute power, where thousands of people devoted their lives to maintaining ceremonies that transformed daily existence into elaborate theatre, and where the price of access to imperial splendor was the complete surrender of personal identity to the demands of eternal ritual. The Forbidden City operated according to cosmic principles that made it not just a residence but an earthly representation of celestial order, where every building, courtyard, and ceremonial space was positioned to reflect the Emperor's role as the Son of Heaven, who maintained harmony between earth and sky. This wasn't mere architectural planning, but religious cosmology made manifest in stone, wood, and tile that required constant human activity to maintain its spiritual effectiveness. The layout of the Forbidden City followed feng shui principles and ancient Chinese theories about the proper relationship between imperial power and cosmic forces, creating a physical environment where every structure served both practical and symbolic functions. The orientation of buildings, the colors of roofs, the number of steps in staircases, and even the arrangement of decorative elements were calculated to demonstrate and reinforce the emperor's divine mandate to rule. The city's division into outer and inner courts reflected Chinese beliefs about the proper separation between public and private imperial functions, with the outer courts serving as spaces for government business and ceremonial activities, while the inner courts housed the emperor's personal living quarters and family residences. This separation created distinct zones with different protocols and access requirements that governed how different categories of people could move through the palace complex. The architectural symbolism extended to every detail of construction and decoration, from the dragons carved on marble staircases to the colors used in painted decorations. Yellow, reserved for the emperor, dominated the color scheme of imperial buildings, while the number 9, representing cosmic completeness, determined everything from the number of door studs to the arrangement of roof ornaments. The scale of the Forbidden City, with its 980 buildings containing 886 rooms arranged around numerous courtyards and connected by elaborate gardens, required a massive workforce to maintain its physical structures while supporting the complex ceremonial activities that took place within its walls. This workforce included everyone from high-ranking court officials to servants who spent their entire lives cleaning and maintaining spaces they might never see used for their intended purposes. The maintenance of the Forbidden City required specialized craftsmen who possessed skills passed down through generations of palace workers, including carpenters, painters, gardeners, and metalworkers, who understood not just technical requirements, but also the symbolic significance of their work. These craftsmen often spent decades perfecting techniques needed to maintain imperial standards, while training apprentices who would continue their specialized knowledge. Daily life within the Forbidden City followed rhythms determined by imperial schedules and ceremonial requirements rather than natural patterns of work and rest that governed life outside the palace walls. The emperor's daily routine of audiences, ceremonies, and administrative meetings created cascading schedules that affected thousands of other residents whose activities had to be coordinated to support imperial functions. The logistics of supporting court life required elaborate systems for food preparation, clothing, maintenance, security, and communication that operated with clockwork precision to ensure that imperial needs were met without disrupting the ceremonial atmosphere that was essential to demonstrating imperial authority. These support systems employed thousands of people whose work remained invisible to the emperor, but was essential for maintaining the illusion of effortless imperial splendor. The emperor's daily existence was so heavily ritualized that spontaneous action or personal preference became nearly impossible, as every activity from waking to sleeping was governed by protocols designed to demonstrate his cosmic significance while protecting his person from any contact with ordinary human concerns that might diminish his divine status. The emperor woke each morning to ceremonies that began before dawn with elaborate dressing rituals performed by eunuch attendants who had trained for years to understand the proper procedures for clothing the Son of Heaven. These rituals involved specific sequences for donning different garments, each of which carried symbolic significance and had to be worn according to precise protocols that reflected both the emperor's divine nature and the day's planned activities. Morning audiences required the emperor to sit motionless for hours while officials presented reports, requested decisions, and performed the elaborate kowtow ceremonies that demonstrated their submission to imperial authority. These audiences followed scripts developed over centuries with specific phrases, gestures, and positions required for different types of business and different ranks of officials. The emperor's meals were elaborate productions involving dozens of dishes prepared by specialized cooks and tested by food tasters to ensure both quality and safety. The presentation of food followed ceremonial requirements that made eating a public performance rather than private nourishment, with specific protocols governing everything from the order in which dishes were presented to the manner in which the emperor indicated his preferences. Imperial clothing changes occurred multiple times each day, as different activities required different ceremonial robes, with each change involving complex rituals performed by teams of eunuch attendants who had memorized the proper procedures for handling imperial garments. The emperor's wardrobe contained thousands of robes, each designed for specific occasions and each requiring specialized knowledge to wear correctly. Evening activities often included entertainment performances, meetings with family members, or private study, but even these apparently personal activities followed established protocols that limited spontaneous interaction or casual behavior. The emperor's bedtime preparations involved elaborate ceremonies designed to ensure his safety and spiritual protection, while demonstrating the cosmic significance of imperial rest. The emperor's personal desires, opinions, and emotional needs were subordinated to the ceremonial requirements of his position, creating a form of existential imprisonment that made genuine human relationships nearly impossible. The protocols designed to protect and honor the emperor simultaneously isolated him from authentic human contact and natural emotional expression. The seasonal cycle of imperial ceremonies created annual rhythms that governed palace life, with elaborate festivals, sacrifice rituals, and administrative ceremonies that required months of preparation and involved thousands of participants. These ceremonies weren't just traditions, but essential activities that maintained the cosmic order upon which imperial legitimacy depended. The emperor's interaction with family members followed formal protocols that made natural familial relationships difficult or impossible, as even his wives and children were required to observe ceremonial behavior that prevented casual conversation or emotional intimacy. Family meals, recreational activities, and private moments were all governed by rules that maintained imperial dignity while limiting genuine personal connection. The concubine system that populated the imperial harem represented one of the most complex and psychologically demanding aspects of Forbidden City life, creating a hierarchy of women whose entire existence revolved around the possibility of gaining imperial favor, while accepting that most would live and die without ever speaking to the emperor personally. The selection process for imperial concubines involved elaborate competitions and evaluations that judged not just physical beauty but also cultural accomplishments, family background, and personality traits that made women suitable for court life. Young women chosen for the palace underwent years of training in court etiquette, cultural arts, and ceremonial behavior before being presented to the emperor. The ranking system within the imperial harem created numerous levels of status, from empresses and imperial consorts down to low-ranking concubines and palace maids, with each level having specific privileges, responsibilities, and living quarters that reflected their position in the hierarchy. Advancement within this system required not just imperial favor, but also political skill and the ability to navigate complex relationships with other women competing for the same goals. Daily life for most concubines involved elaborate beauty routines, cultural study and ceremonial preparations that occupied their time while they waited for opportunities to attract imperial attention. These activities included calligraphy practice, poetry, composition, music performance, and artistic creation that demonstrated their cultural sophistication and worthiness for imperial favor. The competitive dynamics among concubines created intense psychological pressure as women competed not just for imperial attention, but for the security and status that came with bearing imperial children. The birth of a son could transform a low-ranking concubine into a powerful figure within the palace hierarchy, while failure to produce children often meant a lifetime of declining status and increasing marginalization. The isolation of palace women from their families and the outside world created unique psychological challenges as they adapted to lives that offered luxury and status, but limited personal freedom or authentic relationships. Many concubines never left the Forbidden City after entering it as young women, spending their entire adult lives within its walls without experiencing normal social interactions or life choices. The education provided to palace women was sophisticated and comprehensive, including training in literature, history, arts, and philosophy that made them among the most educated women in Chinese society. However, this education served primarily to make them more interesting companions for the emperor, rather than to develop their independent intellectual capabilities. The political influence exercised by some imperial consorts and empresses demonstrated that the concubine system could provide pathways to real power for women who possessed the intelligence and determination to exploit their positions effectively. Some of China's most influential political figures were women who used their positions in the imperial harem to shape government policy and dynastic succession. The aging process within the harem created particular challenges for women whose value was largely based on youth and beauty, as older concubines faced declining status and influence unless they had successfully established political connections or produced important children. The palace provided lifelong support for these women, but their social significance often diminished dramatically as they aged. The emotional cost of harem life affected not just the women directly involved, but also their families, who might gain social status from having a daughter in the imperial palace, but lost normal family relationships and the possibility of grandchildren they could know and influence. The imperial harem created complex webs of separation and connection that affected families across Chinese society. The eunuch system that staffed much of the Forbidden City's administration represented another form of human sacrifice to imperial needs, as boys and young men underwent castration to qualify for palace service that offered opportunities for advancement but required surrendering normal masculine identity and family possibilities. The process of becoming a palace eunuch involved surgical castration performed under primitive medical conditions that resulted in high mortality rates among boys who underwent the procedure. Those who survived faced lifelong health consequences, including hormonal imbalances, bone problems, and other medical issues that were considered acceptable costs for the privilege of palace service. Eunuch education and training prepared these men for administrative, ceremonial, and personal service roles that required literacy, cultural knowledge, and understanding of complex palace protocols. The most successful eunuchs could rise to positions of enormous influence within the imperial administration, sometimes wielding more real power than officially ranked government ministers. The psychological adaptation required for eunuch life created unique personality types characterized by intense loyalty to the imperial system, combined with sophisticated political skills and deep resentment toward the society that had demanded their physical sacrifice. These psychological patterns influenced eunuch behavior in ways that affected imperial administration and palace dynamics. The eunuch hierarchy within the Forbidden City created opportunities for advancement that attracted ambitious young men despite the physical costs involved, as successful eunuchs could accumulate wealth, influence, and status that would have been impossible in their original social circumstances. The most powerful eunuchs maintained elaborate households and wielded influence that extended far beyond palace walls. The relationship between eunuchs and the imperial family was complex and intimate, as these men served as the emperor's most trusted advisors and companions, while being prevented by their physical condition from posing threats to imperial succession or family integrity. This unique position allowed successful eunuchs to develop closer relationships with imperial family members than any other palace residents. The corruption and political intrigue that characterized eunuch influence during some periods of Chinese history reflected both the opportunities and the resentments created by the eunuch system, as men who had sacrificed everything for imperial service sometimes used their positions to enrich themselves or pursue personal vendettas against the society that had mutilated them. The decline of the eunuch system during the later imperial period reflected changing ideas about government administration and growing criticism of institutions that required such extreme personal sacrifice. However, the system persisted until the end of imperial rule because it served essential functions in maintaining palace security and imperial isolation that seemed impossible to replace with alternative arrangements. The broader palace population included thousands of servants, craftsmen, guards, and administrators whose lives were devoted to maintaining the physical and ceremonial infrastructure that supported imperial life, creating a complex society that existed entirely to serve the needs of a single family, while providing livelihoods for entire communities of workers. The servant hierarchy within the Forbidden City ranged from high-ranking positions that required specialized skills and offered opportunities for advancement to menial labor performed by people who might never see the emperor or understand the full significance of their work. This hierarchy created its own social dynamics and opportunities for mobility within the palace system. The training required for different types of palace service was extensive and specialized, with workers learning not just technical skills, but also the cultural and ceremonial knowledge needed to perform their duties according to imperial standards. This training often began in childhood and continued throughout workers' careers as they advanced through increasingly responsible positions. The economic relationships within the palace created a closed system where workers received food, housing, and other necessities directly rather than earning wages that could be spent in outside markets. This arrangement ensured loyalty and security while limiting workers' connections to the broader Chinese economy. The security systems that protected the Forbidden City required elaborate protocols and multiple layers of guards, monitors, and inspectors who ensured that no unauthorized persons could gain access to imperial spaces while preventing palace residents from leaving without permission. These security measures created a prison-like atmosphere that affected everyone who lived within the palace walls. The communication systems within the palace used elaborate networks of messenger signals and written reports that enabled coordination of complex activities while maintaining the hierarchical relationships that were essential to imperial authority. These communication systems operated according to strict protocols that prevented unauthorized information from reaching inappropriate recipients. The seasonal rhythms of palace life included elaborate festival ceremonies and administrative cycles that created annual patterns of intense activity alternating with periods of relative calm. These rhythms were determined by traditional Chinese calendar systems and ceremonial requirements rather than practical considerations about work efficiency or human needs. The decline of the imperial system and the eventual conversion of the Forbidden City into a museum represented the end of a way of life that had persisted for centuries while employing thousands of people in service to a political and religious system that few modern people can fully understand or appreciate. The preservation of the Forbidden City as a historical site allows contemporary visitors to appreciate the architectural and artistic achievements of imperial Chinese civilization, while contemplating the human costs of systems that subordinated individual freedom to collective ceremony and imperial authority. The transformation of palace spaces from functional imperial facilities into museum exhibits has necessarily altered their meaning and significance, as the elaborate ceremonies and daily activities that gave these spaces their original purpose can only be imagined rather than experienced by contemporary visitors. The study of Forbidden City life provides insights into alternative ways of organizing human society and exercising political power, demonstrating both the impressive achievements and the serious limitations of systems that prioritize collective harmony and hierarchical order over individual freedom and personal autonomy. Understanding the daily realities of imperial palace life helps modern people appreciate the freedoms and opportunities that democratic societies provide, while recognizing that different political systems create different possibilities for human fulfillment and achievement. The legacy of the Forbidden City includes not just its architectural and artistic treasures, but also its demonstration of human capacity to create elaborate social institutions that can persist for centuries while shaping the lives of countless individuals who find meaning and purpose within systems that seem constraining or oppressive to outsiders. Standing today in the courtyards where elaborate ceremonies once demonstrated imperial authority, visitors can sense both the grandeur and the isolation that characterized life within these walls, recognizing that the same human desires for beauty, order, and meaning that created this magnificent complex also trapped its inhabitants in roles that limited their freedom, while providing them with purposes larger than individual concerns. The Forbidden City reminds us that human societies can create institutions of remarkable sophistication and longevity, but that the price of such achievements often includes personal sacrifices that may seem unacceptable to people living in different times and circumstances. The palace stands as both monument to human architectural achievement and reminder of the costs of absolute power and rigid social hierarchy. Native American tribal governance. When European colonists first encountered Native American political systems, they found forms of governance so radically different from their own monarchical traditions that many couldn't comprehend how societies could function without kings, nobles, or centralized authority. These weren't primitive or chaotic societies, but sophisticated political systems that had evolved over centuries to balance individual freedom with collective decision-making in ways that would later influence the development of democratic ideals in the New World. Native American tribal governance operated on principles that seemed impossible to Europeans accustomed to top-down authority consensus building that could take days or weeks to reach decisions, leadership roles that carried responsibility without permanent power, and political structures that prioritized community harmony over efficient administration. These systems had maintained social order and resolved conflicts for centuries without the coercive force that European governments considered essential for maintaining civilization. You might assume that societies without written laws, professional armies, or centralized bureaucracies would be unstable or ineffective, but many Native American political systems demonstrated remarkable resilience and adaptability, maintaining social cohesion across vast territories while accommodating diverse tribal groups with different languages, customs, and economic systems. Welcome to a world where political authority derived from wisdom and service, rather than birth or conquest, where decisions affecting entire communities were made through processes that ensured every voice was heard, and where leadership meant accepting responsibility for collective welfare rather than exercising power over subordinates. The Haudenosaunee, known to Europeans as the Iroquois Confederacy, created one of the most sophisticated federal systems in human history, uniting 6 distinct nations under a constitutional framework that balanced local autonomy with Confederate coordination centuries before European political theorists developed similar concepts. This great law of peace established principles of governance that would later influence the framers of the United States Constitution, while demonstrating that effective federal systems could operate without centralized coercive authority. The Confederacy's founding, traditionally dated to around 1142 CE, emerged from the visionary leadership of the peacemaker in Hiawatha, who convinced warring tribes that cooperation offered greater benefits than continued conflict. Their constitutional framework established clear procedures for collective decision-making, while preserving each nation's right to govern its internal affairs according to traditional customs and practices. The Great Council of the Haudenosaunee consisted of 50 chiefs, representing the 6 member nations, with each nation maintaining its traditional number of representatives based on historical precedent rather than population or territory. This arrangement ensured that smaller nations retained equal voice in Confederate decisions while preventing larger groups from dominating the political process through sheer numbers. The selection of chiefs followed procedures that balanced democratic principles with traditional authority structures, as clan mothers chosen by their communities selected chiefs who would represent their interests in the Great Council. These chiefs served at the pleasure of their clan mothers and could be removed if they failed to fulfill their responsibilities or lost the confidence of their constituents. The consensus-building process used by the Great Council required extensive discussion and negotiation before any major decision could be finalized, ensuring that all member nations understood and accepted the implications of collective actions. This process could extend for days or weeks as representatives returned to their home communities for consultation and guidance from their constituents. The Confederacy's constitution included sophisticated procedures for resolving disputes between member nations, establishing neutral arbitrators, and mediation processes that prevented internal conflicts from escalating into warfare. These conflict resolution mechanisms demonstrated understanding that lasting solutions required addressing underlying causes of disagreement rather than simply imposing temporary settlements. The territorial arrangements within the Confederacy preserved each nation's traditional homelands while establishing common areas for hunting, gathering, and ceremonial activities that could be shared by all member groups. This system recognized both collective and individual rights to land use, while preventing territorial disputes that might threaten Confederate unity. The military alliance aspects of the Confederacy provided mutual defense against external threats, while maintaining each nation's right to make independent decisions about participation in specific conflicts. This arrangement enabled coordinated military action when necessary, while preventing any single nation from committing the entire Confederacy to wars that might not serve collective interests. The diplomatic protocols developed by the Confederacy established sophisticated procedures for conducting relations with external groups, including formal treaty-making processes and ceremonial exchanges that reinforced peaceful relationships. These diplomatic traditions influenced European colonial negotiations and established precedents for international relations in North America. The economic cooperation facilitated by the Confederacy included trade networks, resource-sharing agreements, and joint management of common resources that enhanced prosperity for all member nations while maintaining their distinct economic traditions and practices. This economic integration strengthened Confederate bonds while respecting cultural diversity among member groups. Cherokee governance before European contact demonstrated how democratic principles could operate within traditional cultural frameworks, creating political systems that balanced individual rights with collective responsibilities while maintaining social harmony across communities, separated by considerable distances and geographic barriers. The Cherokee political system centered on town councils where all adult community members could participate in discussions about issues affecting their collective welfare, creating genuinely democratic forums for local decision-making that ensured broad community input on important matters. These councils met regularly and could be convened whenever urgent issues required community attention and resolution. The selection of town chiefs followed democratic procedures that combined popular support with traditional qualifications, as communities chose leaders who demonstrated wisdom, speaking ability, and commitment to collective welfare rather than personal advancement. Chiefs served as facilitators and spokespersons rather than rulers, with their authority dependent on continued community confidence and support. The clan system that underlay Cherokee social organization provided additional checks on political power, while ensuring that leadership positions remained connected to traditional kinship networks that maintained cultural continuity across generations. Clan membership created obligations and relationships that influenced political behavior while preventing the concentration of power in individual hands. Women's political participation in Cherokee society was extensive and formally recognized, with clan mothers playing crucial roles in selecting leaders and influencing major decisions that affected community welfare. This political equality reflected broader patterns of gender relations that distributed authority and responsibility between men and women, rather than concentrating power in male-dominated hierarchies. The Cherokee justice system operated through community-based processes that emphasized restoration and reconciliation rather than punishment, reflecting understanding that maintaining social harmony required addressing the causes of conflicts rather than simply penalizing offenders. These restorative justice practices focused on healing relationships and preventing future problems rather than extracting retribution. Intertown coordination among Cherokee communities used Confederate principles similar to those employed by the Haudenosaunee, with regional councils bringing together representatives from multiple towns to address issues requiring broader cooperation. These Confederate structures enabled coordinated action while preserving local autonomy and decision-making authority. The adaptation of Cherokee governance to changing circumstances demonstrated remarkable flexibility and resilience as traditional institutions evolved to address new challenges while maintaining core principles and values that defined Cherokee political culture. This adaptability enabled Cherokee society to respond to European contact while preserving essential elements of their traditional governance systems. The forced removal of Cherokee populations from their traditional territories disrupted but didn't destroy their political institutions, as Cherokee governance systems continued to function in new locations while adapting to radically changed circumstances. This institutional resilience demonstrated the deep cultural roots and practical effectiveness of Cherokee political traditions. Plains tribes developed governance systems adapted to nomadic lifestyles that required rapid decision-making and flexible leadership structures capable of responding to changing environmental conditions and intertribal relationships. These mobile societies created political institutions that could function effectively without permanent settlements or fixed territorial boundaries. The band organization typical of Plains tribes created small, highly cohesive political units led by chiefs who earned their positions through demonstrated competence in hunting warfare and diplomacy rather than through hereditary succession or formal election processes. Leadership positions remained fluid and situational, with different individuals assuming authority depending on the specific challenges facing the band. The council system used by Plains tribes brought together band leaders and respected elders to make decisions affecting multiple groups, creating confederate structures that could coordinate military actions, hunting expeditions, and ceremonial activities while preserving each band's autonomy in day-to-day affairs. These councils operated through consensus-building processes that ensured broad support for collective decisions. Warrior societies within Plains tribes provided alternative leadership structures that balanced the authority of civilian chiefs while creating channels for young men to gain recognition and influence through military achievements. These societies operated according to their own internal governance systems while remaining integrated into broader tribal political structures. The seasonal gatherings that brought together multiple bands or tribes created opportunities for large-scale political coordination and decision-making that addressed issues requiring collective action across wider territorial ranges. These gatherings combined political, social, and ceremonial functions while reinforcing tribal identity and cultural traditions. Age-grade systems in some Plains societies created structured progression through different roles and responsibilities as individuals matured, ensuring that political knowledge and leadership skills were systematically transmitted across generations while providing pathways for advancement that recognized both achievement and experience. The flexibility of Plains governance systems enabled rapid adaptation to changing circumstances, whether environmental challenges like drought or political pressures from neighboring tribes or European expansion. This adaptability reflected deep understanding that political institutions must serve practical needs rather than rigid ideological principles. Gender roles in Plains political systems varied among different tribes, but generally included significant opportunities for women to influence decision-making through their roles in family and clan networks, even when formal leadership positions were primarily held by men. Women's economic contributions and spiritual authority created multiple channels for political influence. The horse revolution that transformed Plains cultures required major adaptations in governance systems, as new mobility and military capabilities changed the scale and nature of political coordination required for effective tribal management. Traditional institutions evolved to accommodate these technological changes while maintaining cultural continuity. Southwest Pueblo societies developed governance systems that integrated political authority with religious responsibilities, creating institutional structures that combined secular decision-making with spiritual guidance in ways that reinforced community cohesion while maintaining connections to ancestral traditions and ceremonial practices. The village-based organization of Pueblo societies created intimate political communities where face-to-face relationships and direct participation were possible for all adult community members, enabling genuinely democratic participation in local governance, while maintaining strong cultural traditions that guided political behavior and decision-making processes. The ceremonial calendar that structured Pueblo community life created temporal frameworks for political activities with different seasons and ritual cycles, determining when major decisions would be made and how community resources would be allocated. This integration of political and spiritual life reinforced traditional values while providing stability and predictability for community planning. The clan and moiety systems that organized Pueblo social relationships created multiple overlapping networks of kinship and obligation that influenced political behavior, while preventing the concentration of power in individual hands or single-family groups. These kinship systems distributed authority and responsibility throughout the community, while maintaining traditional cultural patterns. The selection of Pueblo leaders typically combined religious qualification with community recognition, as individuals demonstrated their worthiness for authority through spiritual knowledge and ceremonial participation, as well as practical wisdom and community service. This selection process ensured that political authority remained connected to traditional cultural values and spiritual practices. The consensus-building processes used in Pueblo decision-making required extensive discussion and consultation until community agreement could be reached on important matters, reflecting understanding that lasting solutions required broad support rather than simple majority rule. These deliberative processes prioritized community harmony over efficiency in decision-making. The conflict resolution mechanisms developed by Pueblo societies emphasized restoration and reintegration rather than punishment or exclusion, reflecting beliefs that community harmony required addressing the spiritual and social causes of conflicts, rather than simply penalizing individual wrongdoing. These restorative practices maintained community cohesion while addressing behavioral problems. The agricultural foundation of Pueblo societies required sophisticated coordination of water rights, land use, and labor allocation that was managed through traditional governance systems adapted to local environmental conditions and cultural practices. This resource management demonstrated how political institutions could address complex technical challenges while maintaining traditional cultural patterns. The resistance of Pueblo societies to Spanish colonial control demonstrated the resilience of traditional governance systems, while revealing how indigenous political institutions could adapt to external pressure while maintaining core cultural values and community autonomy. This resistance reflected deep commitment to traditional political and spiritual practices. Pacific Northwest societies developed governance systems that reflected the region's abundant natural resources and complex social hierarchies, creating political institutions that balanced individual achievement with collective welfare while maintaining sophisticated cultural traditions adapted to coastal and riverine environments. The potlatch system that characterized many Pacific Northwest societies created unique mechanisms for redistributing wealth and establishing social status through ceremonial giving that reinforced political relationships while preventing the excessive accumulation of resources by any single individual or family group. These elaborate ceremonies served multiple political functions while maintaining traditional cultural values and intergroup relationships. The hereditary chief system used by many Pacific Northwest groups combined traditional bloodline authority with performance-based legitimacy, as inherited positions required validation through demonstrated competence in leadership oratory and ceremonial knowledge. Chiefs who failed to meet community expectations could find their authority diminished despite their hereditary claims to leadership positions. The house group organization that structured many Pacific Northwest societies created corporate political entities that combined family lineages with territorial rights and resource management responsibilities, enabling sophisticated forms of collective decision-making while maintaining traditional kinship relationships and cultural practices across multiple generations. The sophisticated legal systems developed by Pacific Northwest societies included complex procedures for resolving disputes, compensating victims of crimes, and maintaining social order through restorative rather than punitive justice mechanisms. These legal traditions demonstrated how indigenous societies could maintain order without centralized coercive authority while addressing conflicts that threatened community harmony. The trade networks that connected Pacific Northwest societies required diplomatic and political coordination across vast distances and multiple cultural groups, creating intertribal governance mechanisms that facilitated economic cooperation while maintaining distinct tribal identities and political autonomy. These networks demonstrated sophisticated understanding of international relations and conflict resolution. The seasonal cycles that governed Pacific Northwest economic activities required political coordination of fishing rights, hunting territories, and gathering areas that involved complex negotiations and traditional agreements between different tribal groups. This resource management system balanced environmental sustainability with community needs while maintaining traditional territorial relationships. The artistic and ceremonial traditions that expressed Pacific Northwest political relationships included elaborate regalia, architectural features, and performance traditions that reinforced social hierarchies while creating opportunities for individual achievement and recognition. These cultural expressions served important political functions while maintaining traditional knowledge and values across generations. The impact of European contact on Pacific Northwest governance systems varied significantly among different tribal groups, with some societies adapting traditional institutions to new circumstances, while others experienced more dramatic disruptions that required fundamental reorganization of political and social structures. The influence of Native American governance principles on the development of the United States Constitution has been extensively documented by historians and political scientists who recognize the significant contributions that indigenous political traditions made to American democratic institutions, particularly through the examples provided by the Haudenosaunee and other Confederate systems. Benjamin Franklin's detailed knowledge of Haudenosaunee governance gained through his extensive diplomatic contact with Confederacy leaders influenced his thinking about federal systems and the possibility of uniting diverse political entities under common constitutional frameworks while preserving local autonomy and self-governance rights. The Albany Plan of Union, proposed by Franklin in 1754, explicitly drew on Haudenosaunee Confederate principles in attempting to create a unified colonial government that could coordinate defense and diplomacy while maintaining individual colony rights and traditional governance structures. Although this plan was rejected, its principles influenced later constitutional development. The Articles of Confederation and the subsequent Constitution incorporated federal principles that paralleled Haudenosaunee practices, including the balance between central coordination and local autonomy that characterized indigenous Confederate systems. These structural similarities reflect direct influence from Native American political examples. The democratic ideals that shaped American political development included concepts of popular participation consensus, building, and leadership accountability that were demonstrated by various Native American societies and observed by colonial leaders who incorporated these principles into their own political thinking and institutional development. The women's suffrage movement in the United States drew inspiration from Native American examples of female political participation, particularly the influential roles played by clan mothers in Haudenosaunee governance, and the gender equality that characterized many indigenous political systems. These examples provided precedents for arguments about women's political capabilities and rights. The environmental protection principles that have become increasingly important in modern American politics reflect Native American approaches to resource management and collective responsibility for natural systems that sustain traditional communities across generations. These indigenous perspectives influence contemporary discussions about sustainability and environmental governance. The restorative justice movement that has gained prominence in modern criminal justice reform draws heavily on Native American traditional practices that emphasized healing relationships and addressing underlying causes of conflicts, rather than simply punishing offenders. These indigenous approaches provide alternative models for addressing crime and social problems. The study of Native American governance systems continues to provide insights for contemporary political science and public administration, offering examples of how democratic principles can operate in different cultural contexts while achieving effective collective decision-making and social coordination. The preservation and revitalization of Native American governance traditions among contemporary tribal communities demonstrates the continuing relevance and effectiveness of indigenous political systems while providing opportunities for non-native societies to learn from alternative approaches to democracy and collective decision-making. Modern tribal governments combine traditional governance principles with contemporary legal and administrative requirements, creating hybrid systems that maintain cultural continuity while addressing the practical challenges of operating within broader American political and economic systems. These modern adaptations demonstrate the flexibility and resilience of indigenous political traditions. The sovereignty rights of Native American tribes within the United States create unique governmental relationships that reflect both historical treaties and continuing recognition of indigenous peoples' rights to maintain their traditional political institutions while participating in broader American society as distinct political entities. The consultation requirements that govern federal agency interactions with tribal governments reflect recognition of Native American sovereignty while creating mechanisms for coordination between different governmental systems. These relationships demonstrate how multiple political systems can coexist within broader federal frameworks while maintaining their distinct characteristics and authorities. The economic development strategies pursued by many contemporary tribal governments combine traditional resource management practices with modern business approaches, creating economic systems that reflect indigenous values while generating revenue needed for community services and cultural preservation activities. The educational initiatives developed by tribal governments often incorporate traditional governance principles into curricula that teach both tribal members and non-native students about indigenous political traditions and their contributions to democratic development. These educational programs help preserve traditional knowledge while building broader understanding of Native American political achievements. The legal challenges faced by tribal governments in maintaining their sovereignty and traditional governance systems reflect ongoing tensions between indigenous rights and state or federal authority, creating complex legal and political relationships that require sophisticated understanding of both traditional and contemporary legal systems. The international recognition of indigenous peoples' rights has provided additional support for Native American governance systems while creating opportunities for tribal governments to participate in global discussions about indigenous sovereignty, self-determination, and cultural preservation. The comparison between Native American governance systems and other indigenous political traditions worldwide reveals common principles and practices that suggest fundamental human approaches to democratic organization and collective decision-making that transcend specific cultural contexts while reflecting universal human needs for participation and self-governance. The academic study of Native American political systems has contributed significantly to political science, understanding of democracy, federalism, and alternative approaches to governance that challenge assumptions about the necessity of centralized authority and coercive power for maintaining social order and collective coordination. The practical applications of Native American governance principles in contemporary organizations include consensus-building techniques, participatory decision-making processes, and leadership models that emphasize service rather than authority. These applications demonstrate the continuing relevance of indigenous political wisdom for modern institutional development. The environmental movement has drawn extensively on Native American examples of sustainable resource management and collective responsibility for natural systems, incorporating indigenous perspectives into contemporary discussions about climate change, conservation, and environmental justice that require long-term thinking and community-based solutions. Understanding Native American governance systems helps modern societies appreciate alternative approaches to democracy and collective decision-making that prioritize community harmony, individual participation, and sustainable resource management over efficiency and centralized control. These examples provide valuable insights for addressing contemporary political challenges while maintaining democratic values and social cohesion. The legacy of Native American political traditions extends far beyond their historical significance to influence contemporary discussions about democracy, federalism, environmental protection, and social justice. These indigenous contributions to political thought and practice continue to offer valuable alternatives to conventional approaches while demonstrating the diversity of human political achievement. Standing today on lands where traditional Native American governance systems once flourished, visitors can appreciate both the sophisticated political achievements of indigenous peoples and the tragic losses that resulted from European colonization and forced assimilation policies. These sites remind us that political innovation and democratic achievement have emerged from many different cultural traditions, and that learning from diverse political experiences enriches our understanding of human possibilities for self-governance and collective coordination. The persistence of Native American governance traditions, despite centuries of suppression and forced assimilation, demonstrates the deep cultural roots and practical effectiveness of indigenous political systems, while providing hope for the preservation and revitalization of alternative approaches to democracy and community organization. Evolution of communication systems. From the first human who climbed a hilltop to signal danger with smoke, to the instant global connectivity of modern digital networks. The story of communication technology is the story of humanity's relentless drive to transcend the limitations of distance, time, and physical presence that have constrained social organization since our species first developed language. Each breakthrough in our ability to communicate across space and time has fundamentally altered human consciousness, social relationships, and the very nature of community itself. The evolution of communication systems reveals a pattern of revolutionary changes that transform not just how we share information, but how we think, relate to others, and understand our place in an increasingly connected world. These advances have consistently exceeded the expectations of their creators, while creating unforeseen consequences that reshape entire civilizations in ways that often surprise both their inventors and their users. You might assume that communication technologies simply make existing human activities more efficient, allowing us to do the same things faster or across greater distances. But the history of communication reveals something far more profound. Each major advance in our ability to share information creates new forms of human consciousness and social organization that would have been impossible without the technological infrastructure that enables them. Welcome to humanity's ongoing quest to overcome the barriers of space and time that separate us from each other, a journey that reveals how our tools for sharing information have shaped not just what we communicate, but who we are as social beings, and how we understand our relationships with others across an increasingly connected planet. The earliest human communication systems emerge from our ancestors' need to coordinate group activities and share information essential for survival, creating the foundation for all subsequent technological developments that would eventually enable global instant communication across vast distances and cultural boundaries. Spoken language. Humanity's first great communication breakthrough enabled complex coordination and information sharing that gave our species unprecedented advantages in competing with other hominids and adapting to changing environmental conditions. The development of sophisticated vocal communication allowed the transmission of detailed information about hunting strategies, tool-making techniques, and social relationships that could be preserved and refined across generations. The invention of symbolic representation through cave paintings, carved symbols, and other visual communications enabled information storage and transmission that transcended the limitations of individual memory and face-to-face interaction. These early symbolic systems allowed communities to preserve important information about seasonal patterns, territorial boundaries, and cultural practices that could be accessed by future generations. Gestural communication systems developed alongside vocal language provided alternative channels for information transmission that could function across distances, where speech couldn't be heard or in situations where silence was necessary for hunting or avoiding detection. These gesture-based systems demonstrated early understanding that different communication methods could serve different functional needs. The domestication of animals created new possibilities for long-distance communication, as humans learned to use birds, dogs, and other animals as message carriers that could traverse distances impossible for human messengers while carrying information between communities separated by geographical barriers or dangerous territories. Drum communication systems developed by various cultures enabled long-distance messaging across territories where visual signals couldn't penetrate dense forests or geographical obstacles. These acoustic systems used standardized rhythmic patterns to convey complex information across networks that could span hundreds of miles through relay stations operated by trained drummers. Smoke signal systems provided visual communication across vast open territories where topographical features enabled signal visibility across great distances. These systems required sophisticated understanding of weather patterns, fuel management, and standardized signal codes that could convey detailed information through relatively simple visual patterns. The development of writing systems represented the most revolutionary advance in human communication capabilities since the emergence of spoken language itself, enabling information storage and transmission that transcended the limitations of individual memory and direct personal contact, while creating possibilities for complex administrative, legal, and cultural coordination. Early writing systems emerged independently in multiple civilizations, as growing social complexity created needs for record-keeping legal documentation and administrative coordination that exceeded the capabilities of purely oral communication systems. These writing systems enabled the development of complex societies by providing mechanisms for maintaining consistent information across large populations and extended time periods. Cuneiform writing, developed by Sumerian civilization, provided the first comprehensive system for recording complex information, including legal codes, administrative records, commercial transactions, and literary works that could be preserved and transmitted across generations. This writing system enabled the development of sophisticated governmental and commercial institutions that required detailed record-keeping and consistent policy implementation. Hieroglyphic systems developed by Egyptian civilization combined pictographic representation with abstract symbolic elements to create versatile communication systems capable of recording everything from religious texts to administrative documents with remarkable precision and artistic sophistication. These writing systems demonstrated how communication technologies could serve both practical and aesthetic functions while preserving cultural information. Alphabetic writing systems that emerged in the Eastern Mediterranean provided more efficient and accessible approaches to written communication by reducing the number of symbols required for literacy, while maintaining the capacity to record complex information with high precision. These alphabetic systems made literacy more achievable for larger populations while enabling the development of extensive literary and scholarly traditions. The development of paper parchment and other writing materials enabled the widespread distribution of written information by providing portable, durable media that could preserve and transmit complex information across vast distances and extended time periods. These material innovations were essential for the development of libraries, schools, and other institutions that depended on the accumulation and transmission of written knowledge. The printing press invention by Johannes Gutenberg in the 15th century represented the next revolutionary advance in communication technology, enabling mass production of written materials that made literacy and information access possible for much larger populations, while accelerating the development and spread of new ideas across European civilization. Movable type printing enabled efficient production of books, pamphlets, and other written materials that could be reproduced in large quantities at relatively low cost, making information accessible to middle-class populations who previously couldn't afford hand-copied manuscripts. This technological breakthrough democratized access to information while enabling the rapid spread of new ideas across social and geographical boundaries. The Protestant Reformation demonstrated the revolutionary potential of mass communication technology as religious reformers used printed materials to spread their ideas more rapidly and widely than would have been possible through traditional oral communication or hand-copied texts. This religious and political transformation illustrated how communication technologies could reshape entire civilizations by enabling new forms of ideological coordination and social mobilization. Scientific revolution developments were accelerated by printing technology that enabled scholars to share their discoveries and theories with colleagues across Europe more efficiently than had ever been possible before. The ability to reproduce complex diagrams, mathematical formulas, and detailed observations in multiple copies facilitated collaborative research and cumulative knowledge development that transformed human understanding of natural phenomena. The newspaper industry that emerged in the 17th and 18th centuries created new forms of public discourse and political participation by providing regular information about current events, government policies, and social issues to literate populations. These periodical publications helped create informed public opinion while enabling political coordination across larger geographical areas than had previously been possible. Postal systems that developed alongside printing technology provided infrastructure for distributing written materials across vast distances while enabling private correspondence and commercial communication that supported the development of trade networks and cultural exchange. These delivery systems were essential for making printed communication practically useful for populations separated by significant distances. The telegraph invention in the 19th century achieved the first near-instantaneous long-distance communication, fundamentally altering human understanding of the relationship between distance and time, while enabling coordination of complex activities across continental and eventually global scales that had never before been possible. Samuel Morse's telegraph system used electrical signals transmitted through wire networks to convey coded messages across vast distances at unprecedented speed, enabling communication that could cross continents in minutes rather than the weeks or months required by traditional transportation-based messaging systems. This technological breakthrough created new possibilities for commercial, governmental, and social coordination. The Atlantic cable projects that connected North America and Europe through underwater telegraph lines created the first truly global communication network, enabling real-time coordination between different continents while demonstrating humanity's growing capacity to overcome geographical barriers through technological innovation and international cooperation. Telegraph networks facilitated the development of modern financial markets by enabling rapid transmission of price information and commercial transactions across vast distances, creating integrated global markets that could respond to events anywhere in the world within hours rather than weeks. This economic integration transformed international commerce while creating new forms of economic interdependence. Railroad coordination became possible through telegraph communication that enabled the safe and efficient operation of complex transportation networks by providing real-time information about train movements, schedule changes, and potential conflicts. This coordination capability was essential for the development of continental transportation systems that supported rapid economic development. News reporting was revolutionized by telegraph technology that enabled newspapers to provide current information about events occurring far from their publication locations, creating the first truly global news systems while transforming public understanding of distant events and international relationships. The telephone invention by Alexander Graham Bell achieved direct voice communication across long distances, enabling more natural and immediate personal interaction than had been possible through telegraph systems, while creating new possibilities for business coordination and social relationships that transcended geographical separation. Telephone networks that developed in the late 19th and early 20th centuries created communication infrastructures that connected individual homes and businesses for the first time, enabling direct personal communication that didn't require specialized technical knowledge or professional intermediaries. This accessibility transformed both business practices and social relationships by making long-distance communication available to ordinary people. The switchboard systems that enabled telephone network operation required large workforces of operators who manually connected calls between different users, creating employment opportunities for women while demonstrating the human labor requirements of early communication technologies. These systems illustrated how technological advances often required supporting infrastructure and human expertise. Long-distance telephone service gradually extended the reach of voice communication across continental and eventually global distances, enabling real-time personal conversation between people separated by thousands of miles, while creating new forms of family and business relationships that would have been impossible without this technological capability. Radio broadcasting achieved wireless communication that could reach multiple recipients simultaneously, creating the first mass communication medium that could deliver information and entertainment to large audiences without requiring physical infrastructure connections to individual receivers. Early radio experimentation by inventors like Marconi demonstrated the possibility of wireless signal transmission across increasing distances, eventually achieving transatlantic communication that proved radio's potential for global communication without the expensive infrastructure required by telegraph and telephone systems. Commercial radio broadcasting that emerged in the 1920s created new forms of mass entertainment and information distribution that brought news, music, and other programming directly into people's homes while creating shared cultural experiences that unified populations across vast geographical areas. The psychological and social impact of radio communication was profound, as families and communities gathered around radio receivers to share information and entertainment that connected them to events and personalities far beyond their immediate geographical areas. This shared listening experience created new forms of cultural participation and social cohesion. Emergency communication capabilities provided by radio systems enabled coordination of disaster response military operations and other critical activities that required rapid information transmission across areas where traditional communication infrastructure might be damaged or unavailable. Television technology combined audio and visual communication to create even more powerful mass communication capabilities that transformed entertainment, education, and political discourse, while creating shared visual experiences that shaped popular culture and social understanding across entire nations and eventually global audiences. The development of electronic image transmission required sophisticated technical innovations, including cathode ray tubes, scanning systems, and broadcast transmission equipment that represented remarkable engineering achievements while creating entirely new industries and forms of cultural production. Television broadcasting created unprecedented opportunities for political communication, as leaders could address entire populations simultaneously while enabling viewers to observe political figures and events directly, rather than relying on written descriptions or still photographs. This visual access transformed political relationships and democratic participation. Educational television programming demonstrated the medium's potential for information transmission and skills development, while creating new approaches to distance education that could reach students in remote areas or those who couldn't attend traditional schools. These educational applications illustrated television's potential beyond entertainment. Global television networks that emerged with satellite communication technology enabled worldwide broadcasting that could transmit information and entertainment across international boundaries, creating shared global experiences while facilitating international understanding and cultural exchange. Digital communication technologies that emerged in the late 20th century achieved unprecedented integration of text, audio, and visual communication, while enabling interactive capabilities that transformed communication from one-way transmission to multi-directional conversation and collaboration across global networks. Computer networking systems developed for military and academic purposes gradually evolved into the internet that connected individual computers worldwide, enabling direct communication between users while providing access to vast databases of information that could be searched and retrieved by anyone with network access. Email systems provided electronic alternatives to postal mail that enabled near-instantaneous text communication across global distances while maintaining the privacy and directed communication characteristics of traditional correspondence. These systems demonstrated how digital technologies could replicate and improve upon existing communication methods. The World Wide Web created user-friendly interfaces for internet communication that made global information access available to general populations rather than requiring specialized technical knowledge. This accessibility breakthrough enabled widespread adoption of digital communication technologies while transforming how people access and share information. Mobile communication technologies freed digital communication from fixed locations while enabling constant connectivity that transformed both personal relationships and business operations by making communication available anytime and anywhere, rather than requiring users to be in specific locations with appropriate equipment. Social media platforms created new forms of community and relationship that transcend geographical boundaries while enabling many-to-many communication that wasn't possible through traditional mass media. These platforms demonstrate how digital technologies continue to create new forms of human social organization and cultural participation. The smartphone revolution integrated multiple communication technologies into portable devices that provide voice, text, email, internet access, and multimedia capabilities, while enabling location-based services and applications that connect digital communication with physical movement and geographical location. Contemporary communication technologies continue evolving toward increased integration, accessibility, and capability while raising new questions about privacy, security, and the social implications of constant connectivity that characterize modern life in developed societies worldwide. The future of communication technology appears to be moving toward even greater integration of different communication modalities while incorporating artificial intelligence, virtual reality, and other emerging technologies that may create communication experiences that transcend current limitations of physical presence and geographical separation. Understanding the evolution of communication systems helps us appreciate both the remarkable achievements that enable contemporary global connectivity and the continuing challenges of ensuring that communication technologies serve human welfare while preserving important values including privacy, authentic relationships, and cultural diversity in an increasingly connected world. The history of communication reveals humanity's persistent drive to overcome the limitations of distance and time that separate us from each other, demonstrating our fundamental nature as social beings who find meaning and purpose through connection with others, regardless of the barriers that physical reality places between us. Standing at the threshold of emerging communication technologies that may enable virtual presence, artificial intelligence assistance, and global connectivity that exceeds anything previously imagined, we can appreciate both the remarkable journey that brought us to this point and the continuing challenges of using our communication capabilities to create more understanding cooperation and human flourishing across our increasingly connected planet. Conclusion. From the soot-choked factories of Industrial Revolution London to the instant global connectivity of modern communication networks, these 5 journeys through history reveal fundamental truths about the human condition and our ongoing struggle to create meaning, maintain dignity, and preserve hope, under circumstances that test the very limits of what it means to be human. The factory workers of 19th century London discovered that technological progress doesn't automatically translate into human progress, as the same mechanical innovations that created unprecedented prosperity also created new forms of suffering and exploitation that reduced human beings to expendable components in industrial machines. Their legacy reminds us that economic advancement without corresponding social protections can create conditions that diminish rather than enhance human dignity. Mary Shelley's creation of Frankenstein during that strange summer of 1816 gave us a prophetic framework for understanding the dangers of scientific advancement without moral reflection, anticipating anxieties about genetic engineering, artificial intelligence, and technological responsibility that remain as relevant today as they were 2 centuries ago. Her teenage nightmare became a permanent part of our cultural consciousness, providing tools for thinking about the unintended consequences of human ambition. Life within China's Forbidden City demonstrated how human societies can create institutions of remarkable sophistication and beauty, while simultaneously constraining individual freedom and personal autonomy in ways that reduce people to components in elaborate ceremonial machines. The palace's magnificent architecture and priceless artworks were built upon human sacrifices that remind us of the costs of absolute power and rigid social hierarchy. Native American tribal governance systems revealed alternative approaches to democracy and collective decision-making that achieved remarkable social harmony through consensus building and shared responsibility, rather than centralized authority and coercive power. These indigenous political traditions influenced the development of democratic ideals, while demonstrating that effective governance can emerge from many different cultural backgrounds and philosophical foundations. The evolution of communication systems shows humanity's relentless drive to transcend the limitations of distance and time that separate us from each other, revealing how our tools for sharing information have shaped not just what we communicate, but who we are as social beings. Each breakthrough in communication technology has created new forms of human consciousness and social organization, while raising fresh questions about privacy, authenticity, and the nature of human relationship. These stories share common themes that illuminate enduring aspects of human nature, our remarkable capacity for adaptation and innovation when faced with extreme circumstances, our tendency to create systems that serve some human needs while creating new forms of suffering, and our persistent desire to connect with others despite the barriers that physical reality and social organization place between us. They remind us that the comforts and freedoms we take for granted today emerged from humanity's long struggle against forces that routinely tested the limits of human endurance, creativity, and moral imagination. The electric lights that illuminate our homes, the democratic institutions that protect our rights, the communication technologies that connect us globally, and the social protections that prevent the worst forms of exploitation, all bear the imprint of individuals who face circumstances that challenged their fundamental assumptions about survival, progress, and human possibility. Perhaps most importantly, these historical examples reveal that human beings possess reserves of strength, ingenuity, and moral courage that are rarely tested in ordinary circumstances, but emerge when survival, dignity, or justice hangs in the balance. They also show us the cost of progress, the psychological damage social inequalities and moral compromises that often accompany our greatest achievements. As we face contemporary challenges including technological disruption, environmental crisis, social inequality and global connectivity that creates new forms of both opportunity and vulnerability. These historical examples remind us that resilience, creativity, and moral courage remain as relevant today as they were in previous eras. The specific dangers and opportunities may have changed, but the fundamental human qualities needed to address them remain constant. The factory workers who endured Industrial Revolution. London, the teenager who imagined Frankenstein, the thousands who lived within the Forbidden City's golden walls, the indigenous leaders who created remarkable political systems, and the inventors who gradually connected our planet through communication networks all faced their own versions of impossible circumstances with whatever courage, wisdom, and humanity they could muster. Their examples challenge us to acknowledge both the achievements and the costs of the progress we often take for granted, while drawing strength from the recognition that human beings have always found ways to adapt, create meaning, and maintain hope, even under conditions that seem designed to crush the human spirit. In the end, these tales of endurance and achievement, innovation and exploitation, beauty and brutality remind us that being human means living with contradictions. We cannot resolve facing challenges we cannot fully prepare for and making choices whose consequences extend far beyond our own lives. They inspire us to appreciate both the fragility and the resilience of human civilization, while accepting our responsibility to use the freedoms and opportunities that previous generations created through their struggles, sacrifices, and unwavering commitment to the possibility of a better world.